Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 2nd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world. At this moment, the U.S. government is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Furthermore, our government is provoking new wars against countries with nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, Korea, and the South China Sea. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country and controlled the world economy for the benefit of that 1%. In all the years since, U.S. administrations have been willing to kill people and make war to, quote, maintain the disparity, close quote, as American planner George Kennan said. The result was nothing less than 3 generations of American war, up to today, against people struggling to control their own countries. Since the Second World War, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of them democratically elected. It's attempted to suppress a populist or national movement in 20 countries. It's grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries. The U.S. has dropped bombs on the people of more than 30 countries and has attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. In total, the United States has carried out one or more of these actions in almost 70 countries. The enemy changes its name from communism to Islamism, but the U.S. makes war against governments not under U.S. control or influence, or that prevent the U.S. from occupying a strategic position in our campaign to control the world economy. In the years since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people in 37 nations. The U.S. continues to be, in the words of Martin Luther King, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The sheer scale of suffering, let alone criminality, is little known in our country. The most numerous victims of our terrorism are Muslims. 500,000 Iraqi infants died in the 1990s as a result of the embargo imposed by the Clinton administration. And extreme jihadism, what we call radical Islamic terrorism, which led to 9/11, was invented by the Carter administration 40 years ago, when the CIA rounded up some Muslim fanatics, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan to, quote, give the Russians a Vietnam of their own, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was established 15 years ago, after the attacks of 9/11-2001, by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. In those years, the U.S. has attempted to, in particular, to exercise that control, not because the U.S. needs oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. A chokehold which benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%. In 2003, the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq and killed perhaps 1 million people for that purpose, and now has thousands of troops and mercenaries throughout the Middle East in pursuit of the control of energy. The U.S. government says that we're fighting terrorism, but we're in fact creating terrorists in response particularly to our drone assassinations, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, as it's been called. It's killed more than 5,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 700 foreign military bases that the U.S. has overseas. Neither Russia nor China has more than 12. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support for human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. Perhaps the most respected Western correspondent in the Middle East for the better part of a generation now has been the independent newspaper's Patrick Cockburn, whose material is published in Britain and on the web here in the U.S. Cockburn writes this week, after his first 100 days in office, we should fear Trump more than ever. He says politicians and establishment media have greeted what they see as President Trump's return to the norms of American foreign policy. That's some British understatement or irony, perhaps, because, of course, the norms of American foreign policy that Cockburn refers to is the ongoing war in the Middle East, the sort of war that Hillary Clinton was advocating during the campaign, and President Trump was apparently denigrating. He, nevertheless, has adopted Clinton's war plans, and that's what Cockburn means by the norms of American foreign policy. These politicians and establishment media, he says, welcome the actual or threatened use of military force in Syria, Afghanistan, and North Korea, and praise Trump's appointment of a bevy of generals to senior security posts. A striking feature of Trump's first 100 days was the way in which the campaign to demonize him and his entourage as creatures of the Kremlin was suddenly switched off like a light as soon as he retreated from his earlier radicalism, his criticism, that is, of Clinton's war plans. In reality, the Trump administration should be more feared as a danger to world peace at the end of his first 100 days in office than it was at the beginning. This is because Trump in the White House empowers many of those who, far from being a safe pair of hands, have led the U.S. into a series of disastrous wars in the Middle East in the post-9/11 era. There's no reason to think that they have changed their ways or learned from past mistakes. This point is understood better in the Middle East than it is in the U.S. and Europe. In Baghdad, for example, people are worried because they see the U.S. building towards a renewed confrontation with Iran, possibly reneging on its nuclear agreement with Tehran and trying to curtail or eliminate Iranian influence in Iraq. Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense and former Marine General, and H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor and General with combat experience in Iraq, are both volubly anti-Iranian. For soldiers like McMaster, the U.S. failure in Iraq was unnecessary and self-inflicted, and they intend to reverse it. A U.S.-Iran confrontation is bad news for Iraq because it may not mean an all-out war, although that's perfectly possible, but it will be fought out on Iraqi territory by local proxies and allies. Iraq really cannot take any more violence, says one Iraqi commentator, and there would be no clear winner. He argues that the experience of the Iran-Iraq War of 1980-88, when the Iranians lost 500,000 dead, is seared into the minds of Iranian leaders, and they will never permit a hostile foreign state like the U.S. to become dominant in Iraq again. Many Western commentators were jubilant over Trump's missile strike in Syria on the 7th of April, interpreting as a return to U.S. policy that demands Assad's departure from the government in Damascus as part of a peace deal. But this policy has long been dead in the water because Assad has no reason to go. Trump's Syrian policy during the presidential election campaign always made more sense than that of Hillary Clinton as the voice of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. That's what Hillary Clinton was. Trump pointed out in the campaign that there was no reason, indeed, to drive an elected president from office in Syria, nor was there any reason to risk American troops and materiel in an ongoing war for control of the Middle East. The great dilemma for ordinary Syrians and the Western powers is that if Assad goes or is weakened, then the main beneficiaries will be al-Qaeda and ISIS. That'll be the new government in Damascus. The choice is between very bad and even worse. There have been propaganda efforts to pretend that the Syrian armed opposition is not overwhelmingly led by Salafi jihadi groups, what we call the rebels, in other words. But these attempts are dying away as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is prone to name changes, mops up its last opponents in northern Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra is the current heir of the al-Qaeda franchise, so to speak. It's an inconvenient reality that any U.S. action taken to weaken the Syrian government will inadvertently benefit the Islamic State and other jihadi groups. The Syrian government is essentially the anvil to the U.S.-led coalition's hammer against ISIS. While the U.S.-backed forces surround Raqqa, the ISIS capital, the Islamic State is engaged in intense fighting with the Syrian government around Palmyra and in other parts of Homs and Deir al-Zur provinces. These are the provinces in eastern Syria. If ISIS were to capture Deir al-Zur, the largest city in eastern Syria, this would rejuvenate the group even if it loses Raqqa and Mosul, the cities that are being assaulted now, that are principal capitals of ISIS. There are some who say the U.S. wouldn't be unhappy with this result. It prefers a stalemate. The U.S. government prefers a stalemate in Syria because that presents any concentrated rival to U.S. control of Middle East energy resources joining any other states in the region. We prefer the disorder and the ongoing killing to a solution that would not be in the interest of American clients. The Trump administration says its priority is still to eliminate ISIS, and nobody openly disagrees with this, but the resurgent influence of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, along with that of Israel and the neocons, despite their dismal record in Iraq and Syria, is good news for ISIS. Washington is seeking closer relations with Sunni states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which have shadowy links to Salafi jihadi groups, the rebels, and were at odds with President Obama to some extent. People and policies gaining the power to make decisions in the Trump administration are the very same as those who helped turn the wider Middle East from the Hindu Kush to the Sahara, the whole range of what we call the Middle East, into an arena for endless wars. They have no idea how to end these conflicts and show little desire to do so. It almost does seem that what America really wants is an ongoing, low-level war in the region, so no serious opponents to American control of the energy resources of the region can arise. There's a more general reason why Washington may in future be more inclined to employ the threat or use of military force to protect its power. This is because its political, economic, and ideological power is declining relative to the rest of the world. It was at its apogee, at its high point, between the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the financial crisis of 2007 to 8. The rise of China and the return of Russia as an international player cramps the U.S. ability to act unilaterally. The election of Trump is evidence of a deeply divided society. It's to be remembered that one of the aspects of the Trump campaign was an attack on the war policy of the Obama administration. As a military power, the U.S. can still claim predominance. International derision of Trump was instantly muted when he fired 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria, dropped a big bomb in Afghanistan, and claimed, falsely as it turns out, that a U.S. armada was sailing towards North Korea. The lesson of recent U.S. foreign interventions is that it's difficult to turn military power into political gains, but this does not mean that Washington will not continue to try to do so. Trump will have learned over the last month that minimal saber-rattling abroad produces major political dividends at home. Leaders down the ages have been tempted to stage a small, short, successful war to rally their country behind them. Frequently, they have got this absolutely and self-destructively wrong, and these wars have turned out to be large, long, and unsuccessful. Trump campaigned as an isolationist, which should protect him from foreign misadventures, but he's never had many isolationists around him. The architects of America's failed military intervention since Afghanistan are still in business, or back in business again, perhaps. Strip Trump of his isolationism, and what you have left is largely jingoistic bravado and bragging about a return of American greatness. In future crises, both these impulses will make compromise more difficult and war more likely. That's Patrick Coburn assessing the change in direction of the Trump administration from the criticism of American wars that occurred during the campaign to his apparent sponsorship of the same war policy that Barack Obama was following and Hillary Clinton was promoting during the campaign. Now, I must say that in terms of contemporary American war policy, and indeed domestic policy as well, Trump is finally not the problem. And demonstrating against Trump, as many good American liberals are these days, is worse than useless because it reinforces the claim of the neoliberal and neoconservative political establishment that backed Obama, Bush, and other recent administrations. It reinforces their claim to rule. Trump is an interloper in their view. It's, of course, worthwhile to examine the source of the Trump presidency. Why did he get elected? Because that's to be found in the enormities committed by that political establishment, represented by Obama and Clinton. Trump became president by criticizing those crimes, as many Americans recognized, crimes against the economy and crimes against the world at large in war. But Trump is so weak as president that the establishment has reasserted its control, and he's reversed in practice his criticism of neolib and neocon policies. We should be demonstrating not against Trump, but against U.S. wars and mass murder. We should be demanding that U.S. troops and weapons be brought home, and that the Obama-Clinton wars be ended. And we should be demonstrating against the immiseration of the majority of Americans, as inequality continues to grow at an accelerating rate, and Americans see their life chances confiscated, even in comparison with those of their parents. That's what made Trump president, even though he's now switched sides. We frequently hear, and we have from the time of the campaign, that Trump is an authoritarian. But as Corey Robin points out in an article this week, Trump hasn't filled 85% of the open positions in the executive branch in his administration. It's a strange kind of authoritarian who fails to seize control of the state apparatus, as the political scientists say. Robin writes, "A wise psychoanalyst once told me, stop looking at what you're saying, look at what you're doing. If only journalists applied the same rule to Donald Trump." Last Friday night, Trump complained that he was being stymied by archaic rules in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and warned, quote, "maybe at some point we're going to have to take those rules on," close quote. A journalist at the Washington Post was quick to diagnose this statement, quote, "Now Trump is talking about consolidating his power. Whether this is just him blowing off steam or signaling what lies ahead, it's significant because it suggests a president yet again who doesn't agree with his own powers being limited or even questioned. Remember when senior policy advisor Stephen Miller declared, "The powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned"? This is more of that kind of attitude, so says the Washington Post. He wants more power, the Post says. Trump wants more power, and he wants it quickly. It's not difficult to connect this to his past admiration for authoritarian leaders, and these comments are likely to give Democrats, and even some in the GOP establishment, plenty of heartburn. This is a demonstrated pattern for him for all the reasons listed at the top of this post, close quote. Once again, the notion of Trump the authoritarian, which was being bruited about by the political establishment long before the presidential campaign got underway even. This kind of narrative of Trump the authoritarian is popular among journalists like Vox's Ezra Klein and academics like Yale historian Timothy Snyder, two of the greatest mythmakers in contemporary journalism, I think. It's the background mood music of a lot of liberal commentary in the U.S., but it depends on paying almost exclusive attention to what Trump says rather than what he does. If Trump were actually serious about consolidating his power, he might start by, perhaps consolidating his power. Instead, this is what he's been doing or not doing since he's been in office. Quote, "The Senate has confirmed 26 of Trump's picks for his cabinet and other top posts. But for 530 other vacant senior-level jobs requiring Senate confirmation, the president has advanced a total of 37 nominees." Close quote. Trump, in other words, has failed to fill 85% of the positions in the executive branch that he needs to fill in order to run the government. It's a strange kind of authoritarian who fails as a first order of business to seize control of the state apparatus, not because there's been pushback from the Senate, but because in most instances he hasn't even tried. But Trump's liberal and left critics will respond that failure to fill key positions is all part of the White House master plan. Back in February, Steve Bannon, Trump's top strategist, whose star has lately fallen, claimed that the administration's goal was, quote, "the deconstruction of the administrative state," close quote. As Bannon made clear, that was just a fancy way of describing the long-standing Republican goal of gutting rules and regulations that the business class hates. What better way to do that than simply not staffing the agencies that are tasked with enforcing those rules and regulations? There are two problems with this theory. First, Trump has failed to fill positions in departments and agencies he actually wishes to empower and expand. He's only filled 1 out of 53 positions in the Pentagon, 2 out of 14 in the Department of Homeland Security, 1 out of 7 positions in the intelligence agencies, 1 out of 28 positions in the Treasury Department, and almost none of the key positions in the Justice Department having to do with terrorism, drug crime, prosecution, and the like. Second, many of those positions are not empty. Until Trump appoints someone to fill them, they will remain mostly occupied by holdovers from the Obama administration, who will continue to enforce the thousands of rules and regulations Obama passed and Trump says he hates. Though Trump has had limited success overturning some of Obama's rules through an obscure piece of legislation, the real work of deregulation and undoing Obama-era rules require a much heavier lift than Trump is yet in a position to execute. Despite the fact that Trump, whose party is in control of all the elected branches of the federal government, has lost virtually every legislative battle he's waged and backed down from virtually every bluff he's made, the faith in Trump's power, not in his probity or purposes, but in his ability to dominate the political scene, dies hard. And nowhere harder, it seems, than on the left. In March, Corey Robin writes, "I was on a panel of liberal scholars and writers where it was the universal consensus that Trump had an almost intuitive grasp of and control over public opinion, as evidenced by his tweets, which were held to be the invisible puppet strings of the American mind. This was not long after Trump's travel ban had been overturned by the courts, and Trump had responded by tweeting his contempt for and hostility to the judges involved. It seemed like the classic demagogue's move, whipping up the masses against elite judges, so there was some nervousness on the panel about what Trump might do to bring these recalcitrant judges to heel. Trump has since repeated that charge against the judiciary, and his critics have repeated their concern. Now Snyder says, quote, it's pretty much, this is Timothy Snyder at Yale, it's pretty much inevitable that Trump will declare a state of emergency and try to seize full control of the government, close quote. As I pointed out to my co-panelists, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was rebuffed by the judiciary, he tried to overhaul the Supreme Court with his infamous court packing scheme. Now that was an assertion of executive power. In the face of judges frustrating his agenda, all Trump managed was to admit a plaintive tweet promising to appeal the ruling. Quote, I'll see you in court, close quote. Even that Trump couldn't be bothered in the end to do. Instead, he withdrew his appeal, revised his travel ban, and found his ban back in court, where it remains. But even more important, Trump's Svengali-like control of American public opinion is belied by the fact that most of America has disapproved of him for most of the time he's been in office. We would say it's because he's adopted Clinton's policies, but still. In March, moreover, Trump saw precipitous drops in support from his base, Republicans, white people, and men. Every day he's in office, fewer and fewer people believe that he'll keep his promises, that he's strong and decisive, and that he can bring about the changes the country needs. And as the Wall Street Journal recently reported, despite Trump's consistent opposition to immigration and free trade, public support for those positions has gotten consistently stronger. Record highs in the case of free trade, and in the case of immigration, the highest it's been in over a decade, since Trump came into office. There's little doubt that Trump's administration has pursued policy designed to make life crueler and harder for immigrants, people of color, and others. There's also little doubt that some of his administration, particularly his Attorney General, Jefferson Sessions, will be successful in doing so. But with the exception of immigration, most of these aims are long-standing Republican goals. They reflect no peculiar authoritarianism on Trump's part. They're just the revanchist stock and trade of the American right, which any Republican president would pursue. When it comes to advancing the singular potency of the presidency, whether that means controlling public opinion, consolidating the power of the executive branch, or dominating Congress, Trump has been an abject failure. Whatever fantasies he or the media or his critics may have about the presidency abound, the last 100 days have shown that Trump has no realistic agenda for or steady interest in consolidating power. Strong leader is a slogan for Trump, a rhetoric, a performance, and that's about it. Trump has always thought his words were more real than reality. He's always believed his own nonsense. It's time his liberal critics stop believing it too and promoting it as a way in which they can ensure, they think, their return to power as it existed in the Bush and Obama days. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 18th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. The second half of tonight's show is an interview of WikiLeaks' Julian Assange, but the only major party anti-war presidential candidate in recent American history, Ron Paul. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for AWARE for the articles referred to tonight. There will be movies at the Art Theater in the next week and a half referring to the Mideast, beginning with a film on Egypt tonight. Panels and leaflets from AWARE will be available at the theater, and AWARE will also have a table at the Farmers Market opening up in Lincoln Square in the next week and two. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.